The text message came at 11:47 on a Thursday night, and I read it 3 times before my brain could fully process what I was seeing. My mother had written, "You've always made everything about yourself. Don't bother calling again tonight. We're busy." I was lying in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm, a surgical consent form on the tray beside me, and my 4-year-old son sitting alone in a waiting room 2 floors down. I want to tell you that I was surprised. I want to tell you that after everything, after 7 years of double shifts, after all the money I had quietly, faithfully poured into that family, I didn't see it coming. But the honest truth is that some part of me had always known. I had just refused to believe it until that moment. With the fluorescent lights humming above me and the beeping of my monitor counting out every second I had left to figure out what to do. My name is Lauren. I'm 29 years old. I'm an ICU nurse. I'm a single mother by choice. And for the better part of a decade, I was the financial spine of a family that saw me as nothing more than a very convenient, very reliable source of income. Let me explain how we got here, because it matters. I started nursing school at 19 on a combination of scholarships and federal loans. My parents were not poor, exactly, but they were not careful people with money. My father had worked in construction management for years, and my mother had always stayed home. When the housing market shifted and his contracts dried up, things got tight fast. I was 22 and just finishing my first year of working full-time in the ICU when my father called and asked if I could help with the car payment for a few months. Just until he got back on his feet. Just temporarily. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my father. Those few months turned into 7 years. By the time I was 25, I was covering their car payment, contributing $600 a month toward household expenses, and paying the first 2 years of my younger brother Derek's college tuition because my parents said they simply didn't have it. I was working 3 12-hour shifts a week at the hospital and picking up extra agency shifts on my days off. I was exhausted in a way that lived behind my eyes and settled into my bones by Sunday evening every single week. But I kept going, because I told myself that was what you did for family. You showed up. You gave what you could. You didn't keep score. What I didn't fully understand then, what I understand completely now, is that I was the only one operating by those rules. My brother Derek was the favorite. He had been since we were children, and I had made peace with that a long time ago, or so I thought. He was charming and funny, and my parents had always softened around him in a way they never quite did with me. When he dropped out of the college program I was paying for after 18 months, my mother called to let me know, and in the same breath, asked if I could start contributing to his car payment instead, since he would need reliable transportation while he figured things out. I asked what he was planning to do. She said he was thinking about things. He was 22 years old and thinking about things. And I was 26 and working back-to-back overnight shifts so his car payment wouldn't bounce. I want to be clear about something, because I know what it sounds like. I was not a martyr. I was not naive. I made choices, and I made them knowingly. And the reason I kept making them is that I genuinely loved my family. And I truly believed that if the situation were ever reversed, they would do the same for me. I was wrong. But I didn't find that out until the night my appendix nearly killed me. Mason came into my life 3.5 years ago. I had always wanted to be a mother, and I had watched enough of my own dating history to understand that waiting for the right partner wasn't a plan I could count on. I went through the process carefully, thoughtfully, over the course of about a year. When Mason was placed in my arms at 6 days old, something in me that had been wound tight for years finally let go. He was the most serious, most curious, most gentle little person I had ever met, and from the very first week, he was the reason I did everything. My parents were not warm about my decision to adopt as a single mother. My mother said it was selfish. My father said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Derek thought it was, and I quote, a lot. But they came around, the way families do slowly, then all at once, and mostly when Mason turned out to be exactly the kind of bright, affectionate child who made grandparenting feel like a reward rather than a responsibility. I had been paying for an upgrade to my parents' cell phone plan for 2 years. I mention that only because it is how my mother sent that text message so clearly and quickly from a poolside chair in Cancun. Here is how the night happened. I had just finished a 12-hour shift. I picked Mason up from his aftercare program at 6:15, and he fell asleep in his car seat on the way home, his cheek pressed against his stuffed elephant, his shoes still on. I carried him inside and put him on the couch while I heated up the dinner I had prepped on Sunday. Somewhere around 7:30, I felt a pain in my lower right side that I recognized immediately, because I am a nurse and I know what that particular ache means when it begins to sharpen and radiate and refuse to be ignored. I waited 20 minutes. The way you do when you don't want to believe your body is doing what your body is doing. Then I called my mother. I explained the situation clearly and calmly. I told her I was almost certain I needed to go to the emergency room. I told her I needed someone to come stay with Mason, or to take him for the night. I told her it was important. She put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she told me that they were in the middle of dinner and that Derek had already gone to bed, and maybe I could call a neighbor. I asked her if she was hearing what I was saying. I told her I might need emergency surgery. She said she was sure I would be fine and that I tended to catastrophize. I hung up and called my father directly. He let it ring through to voicemail. I called my brother. He picked up, and I could hear noise in the background, and he said, "And I want to be very precise here," he said, "Lauren, I really can't deal with this right now, okay? I've got people over." I sat on my kitchen floor for approximately 90 seconds. Mason was still asleep on the couch. The pain was now consistent and traveling upward. I called my neighbor, Claire, who is 63 years old and retired and who once told me that if I ever needed anything, any time, day or night, I should not hesitate. I had always considered that the kind of thing people say without fully meaning it. Claire answered on the second ring, was at my door in under 5 minutes, and held Mason against her shoulder while I backed out of the driveway and drove myself to the emergency room. The ER confirmed appendicitis within the hour. The surgeon told me it needed to come out that night. I was alone in a pre-op bay when I texted my mother the update. I kept it simple. I said I was about to go into surgery and that Mason was with Claire. I said I was scared. That was when she sent the message. "You've always made everything about yourself. Don't bother calling again tonight. We're busy." I stared at the ceiling for a long time. The anesthesiologist came in and introduced herself, and I remember thinking that she had the kindest eyes I had ever seen on a stranger, and I was so grateful that someone in that building was looking at me like I was a person worth looking at. When I woke up from surgery, it was nearly 2 in the morning. The nurse checking my vitals told me everything had gone smoothly. She asked if there was anyone I wanted her to call. I said no. Then I asked for my phone. I had a voicemail from Claire saying Mason was sleeping in her guest room and not to worry about a single thing. I had a text from my colleague Britt from the ICU, who had somehow heard through the hospital grapevine and was asking if I needed anything. I had a voicemail from my grandmother. I did not have a single message from my mother, my father, or my brother. My grandmother. I should tell you about her. She is my father's mother, and she is 71 years old. And she is the sharpest, most clear-eyed person I have ever known. She lives alone in a house 40 minutes outside the city, grows tomatoes in her backyard, and has approximately 0 patience for self-deception of any kind. She had never been particularly vocal about my parents' behavior toward me. She was not the type to interfere, but she had always watched. I had felt her watching for years. I had always known, on some level, that she saw exactly what was happening and had simply been waiting for the moment when it mattered enough to say something. I called her back at 2:15 in the morning. She answered immediately. She said, "I heard. I'm coming in the morning." I started to say she didn't need to do that, and she cut me off very gently and said, "Lauren, I'm coming in the morning." She was there by 9. She brought a bag for 3 days. She picked Mason up from Claire's house and brought him to me, and he climbed carefully up onto my hospital bed and pressed his face against my neck and said, "Mama, are you all fixed?" And I held him as tightly as I was able and said, "Yes, baby, I'm all fixed." My grandmother sat in the chair beside my bed, and while Mason ate the animal crackers she had brought him, she asked me to tell her everything. I did. I told her about the phone call, and the voicemail, and the text message. I read her the text message. I watched something move across her face, not surprise, exactly, more like the quiet, devastating confirmation of a thing she had already suspected. She said, And where are they right now? I had done some thinking in the hours since surgery. I had been awake at 4 in the morning with nothing to do but lie there and think, and I had gone through my memories with the specific clarity that comes after shock has worn off and something colder and more honest has taken its place. I thought about the last 5 phone calls I had received from my mother, and I tried to identify how many of them had begun with a question about how I was doing before arriving at the request. I counted carefully. The answer was 1, and I was not entirely certain that 1 had been genuine. I thought about the Cancun trip. My mother had mentioned it in passing 3 months ago. She and my father and Derek were planning a long weekend, maybe 4 days, probably in the spring. She had said it casually, the way you mention something that has already been decided. She had not asked if I wanted to come. She had not mentioned the cost. I had not thought to ask, because I had been too tired and too busy, and I suppose I had learned not to look too closely at certain things. It was only lying there in that hospital bed at 4 in the morning that I did the arithmetic. My father had not been working steadily for the past 8 months. Derek had been, as always, thinking about things. My mother did not work. I had been depositing $600 a month into their shared account like clockwork for 7 years. That was a number I had never sat down and actually calculated before that night, and when I calculated it, I had to set my phone down on the blanket and breathe for a moment. To my grandmother, I said, "They're in Cancun, all 3 of them." She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "On what money?" I didn't answer. She nodded slowly, the way she does when something has just become exactly as clear as she suspected it would be. By the time I was discharged 2 days later, I had made some decisions. I want to be honest about the fact that it was not a dramatic, cinematic moment of transformation. It was not a sudden burst of rage or righteous fury. It was quieter than that. It was more like the feeling you get when you have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and you finally set it down, and your arms are shaking from the effort but also from the relief, and you realize that you have been so focused on holding it that you had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. I made 3 calls from my hospital room before I was discharged. The first was to my bank. I removed my parents from the shared account I had set up years ago for the convenience of the monthly transfers. I stopped the automatic payment I had been making to their household expense fund. I sent a single text to my father. No explanation, no argument, just 3 sentences. "I've removed the automatic transfers. I won't be covering the car payment going forward. Take care of yourselves." The second call was to the financial aid office of the university Derek had re-enrolled in after his first dropout. Using a tuition contribution I had been making quarterly, I withdrew the contribution authorization. Whatever he did next was going to be with someone else's money. The third thing I did was not a call. I opened my mother's contact on my phone, and I looked at that text message one more time. "You've always made everything about yourself," and then I blocked her number. I blocked my father's. I blocked Derek's. Then I put my phone face down on the tray table and watched Mason draw a picture of a fire truck on the back of a hospital menu, and I felt, for the first time in recent memory, completely still. My grandmother drove us home. She stayed for 4 more days, cooking and doing laundry and sitting with Mason in the evenings while I rested, and she never once asked me whether I was sure about what I had done. She had raised her son and watched him become a man who let his daughter support his family for 7 years without a word of acknowledgement, and I think whatever she might have said about the matter, she had already said privately, long ago, in a conversation I would never be part of. On her last night, after Mason was asleep, she sat across from me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea and she said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it." I said, "Okay," she said. "The people who love you show up. That's the whole thing. That is the entire definition. Everything else is a story people tell themselves so they don't have to show up." I didn't say anything. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She said, "I didn't show up either. Not in the way I should have. I watched for years and I didn't say enough, and I'm sorry for that." I told her she was here now. She said, "Yes, and so are you." 16 days after I came home from the hospital, there was a knock at my front door on a Saturday afternoon. I was on the couch with Mason, halfway through a movie about a bear who gets lost in a city and is taken in by a very patient family. And my first instinct when I heard the knock was that it was my neighbor Claire, coming by with the loaf of bread she had mentioned baking. I opened the door without looking through the peephole. My mother was standing on my porch. My father was one step behind her, and Derek was at the bottom of my porch steps, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the ground. My mother looked the way she always looked when she was preparing to receive something slightly dressed up, expression carefully arranged into something that wanted to read as concern, but kept slipping toward the particular tension of someone who has rehearsed what they plan to say and is waiting for their cue to begin. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at my father. He met my eyes, and then looked away. I said, "Mason, can you go to your room and play for a few minutes, buddy?" He looked at the people at the door with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a 4-year-old, said okay, and disappeared down the hallway. My mother started immediately. She said she had been worried sick. She said she hadn't known what to do. She said the trip had already been paid for. She actually used that phrase, already been paid for, as though that settled something, and that they couldn't have just canceled at the last minute, and that I had never told them how serious it was. I let her finish. Then I said, "I sent you a text message at 11 o'clock at night telling you I was about to go into emergency surgery. You told me not to call again because you were busy." She said she had been upset. She said I had a way of making her feel guilty for things that weren't her fault. My father said quietly, "Lauren." I said, "I would like you to hear something." I had my phone in my hand and I opened the message thread and I read the text out loud. I read every word of it, slowly, in the voice she had sent it in, not accusatory, not loud, just the plain words in the order she had written them while she stood on my porch and listened. When I finished, nobody said anything for a moment. My brother was still looking at the ground. I said, "I don't have anger about this anymore. I want to be honest with you about that. What I have is clarity. I spent 7 years giving you everything I could because I believed that was what family did. I've spent the last 2 weeks understanding that I was the only one who believed that." My mother started to say something and I said, gently but completely clearly, "I'm not finished." She stopped. I said, "I'm not going to be supporting you financially going forward. I'm not going to be someone you call when you need something covered. I have a son to raise and a life to rebuild, and I'm going to do both of those things with the energy I've been spending on holding up a structure that was never going to hold me up in return." My father looked up then. He looked older than I had noticed before, and something in his face had shifted from the practiced blankness he usually wore and arrived somewhere that looked, if I was being charitable, like the very early beginning of understanding. He said, "We made mistakes." I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know how to fix it." I said, "I know. That's not actually something I can help you with." I told them I needed them to go. I told them that if, in time, they wanted to talk honestly about what had happened and what they were willing to do differently, I was open to that conversation. But I also told them I was not going to hold my breath, and I was not going to put my life on pause while I waited to find out. My mother's face had gone through several expressions while I was speaking. At the end, it had settled into something I did not recognize at first, something tight and a little lost, the look of someone who has arrived at a door they expected to open and found it simply, quietly, closed. She said, "What about Mason? He needs his family." I said, "He has family. He has me. He has his great-grandmother, who drove 40 minutes to sleep on a cot in my hospital room so I wouldn't be alone. He's not missing anything that was ever reliably there." They left. I stood at my front door and watched my father's car pull away from the curb, and then I closed the door and stood in the hallway of my own house in the quiet and felt the specific, solid sensation of a thing being completed. Not healed, I don't think that's the right word for it, and I distrust the tidiness of it anyway. Completed, acknowledged, set down. Mason appeared from the hallway, trailing his stuffed elephant by one ear. He said, "Are the people gone?" I said yes. He said, "Can we finish the bear movie?" I said absolutely we can. He climbed up onto the couch and tucked himself under my arm, and I reached over and pressed play, and the bear on the screen was finding his way home to the family that had chosen him, And I thought about my grandmother making the drive across town the morning after my surgery, overnight bag already packed, because it had not occurred to her for even a moment to do anything other than show up. I thought about Claire, 63 years old and already in her pajamas, opening her front door in under 5 minutes and holding my sleeping son against her shoulder so I could get in my car. I thought about Britt from the ICU texting me from her break room to ask if I needed anything. I thought about the anesthesiologist with the kind eyes who had introduced herself and shaken my hand before I went under, who had no obligation to be gentle and had chosen to be anyway. I had spent so many years trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided what I was worth to them. I had spent so much energy maintaining a connection that was mostly transactional, mostly conditional, mostly moving in one direction. What I understood now, sitting in my own living room with my son pressed warm against my side, was that the family I had been so desperately trying to hold together had never been the one I actually needed. The one I actually needed had been assembling itself around me all along, quietly, in the form of retired neighbors and hospital colleagues, and one sharp-eyed grandmother who drove 40 minutes without being asked. You don't get to choose the family you're born into, but you do get to choose what you build. I was done building things that were designed to hold everyone up except me. My grandmother came for Mason's birthday 3 weeks later. She brought a chocolate cake she had made from scratch, and a card signed in her careful, old-fashioned handwriting, and while Mason destroyed the wrapping paper on his gifts with the focused intensity of a small person who takes birthdays seriously, she sat beside me at the kitchen table and squeezed my hand once, briefly, without saying anything. I squeezed back. Outside, the late afternoon sun was coming through the kitchen window, the way it does in early spring, low and long and almost golden, and Mason was laughing at something, and it was one of those moments that settles into you quietly and stays. I had an early shift the next morning. I had a lunch planned with Britt on Thursday. I had a dentist appointment for Mason on Friday that he was already deeply suspicious of, and I was already composing the particular combination of honesty and reassurance that 4-year-olds require. I had a life. I had built it largely alone, and it was real, and it was mine, and I was keeping it. If you've been holding something up that was never going to hold you something, or someone that took your strength and your time and your money and called it love, I want you to hear me when I say this. Setting it down is not giving up. It is not failure. It is the most necessary, most honest thing you may ever do for yourself. The people who love you will show up when it matters. That is the entire definition. Everything else is a story. Put it down. And once they stop shaking, you might be surprised how far you can go.